What was this place, and what was life like for those who worked here? Let's find out. Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to give you an insight of what this area was back in the day and what life was like for people living around here. So before we get into this, if you haven't already, then subscribe to the channel. The Smelt Mill complex contains the remains of two surviving mills, the upper mill to the north on a level terrace in the hillside and the lower mill to the south. The upper mill is the older and is believed to be known from documents as New Mill. Constructed in the late 18th century, the lower mill is Old Gang Mill. Swaledale at the start of the 21st century is known mostly for its beautiful countryside. Up until the end of the 19th century, the hills around the valley swarmed with hundreds of men engaged in the industry of extracting minerals from veins beneath the moors. Men toiled underground. Chimneys on the moor tops spewed toxic gases from smelt mills. Ponies pulled carts of metal ignites to market in Richmond, and life for those in the Dale was hard and poor. The main mineral being extracted from the hills was galena, which produces lead. Lead was mined in Swaledale from at least the time of the Romans. What you're looking there is now one of the chimneys. Litters around the countryside in many places are circular depressions in the ground where a bell pit shaft was sunk to the ground and not extracted. The galena would be smelted to create lead, with the earliest known method to do this being simply a very large open fire in the hillside called a bale hill, where the lead would pour out the side to be collected and cooled into ignites. These are called pigs. The good times were rare, however. It was usually only the mine bosses who saw any kind of decent share of the profits, as miners were paid only according to the amount of ore they brought out of the hills. Miners and their families usually struggled to survive. They would usually have a small holding of a few animals, and a very common sight was to see people going about their daily business knitting. Miners would knit while walking the miles to and from work, both to produce things for their own needs and to sell. It was always hard to make the ends meet for the men of the Dale and their families. There were many jobs a man or boy could have in the industry. Even before men could head underground with a pick and shovel, prospectors and surveyors would have to find the vein of the galena. One of the most common methods to find these veins was called hushing, and this practice has left very visible, lasting scars on the landscape. To those who don't know, many of the small side valleys jutting off from places like Gunnerside, Gilland, Ark and Garthdale may seem entirely natural, when in fact they were created just a couple of hundred years ago. Springs up on the moor tops were dammed to create large artificial lakes. The dam would then be demolished, and the torrents of water running down the hillside would strip all the topsoil and loose material off, washing it down the streams in the valley bottom. The tops of the ore veins could easily be seen, and then the mining begun. The veins were usually only a couple of metres wide, but extended down to very great depths. Mining them was usually done by driving in levels from lower down the hillside, and from these levels the miners would then dig up and down into the veins with the ore and copious amounts of draining water going back out of the level. The men who worked at the face blasting the rock and finding the ore were called the ore winners. The other group of men worked underground were the deadmen, whose job it was to take the deads, the useless rock, and deposit it in the space the mine left open by the previous working. Boys over the age of 12 have a job of dragging mine carts of ore out of the surface, though in some levels small ponies did this task. Once on the surface the ore was dressed. This involves separating as much as possible from other rocks. Large pieces would be done by hand, but for smaller pieces of ore a method called bousing was created, which involved using water and gravity to separate the heavy ore from the less heavy surrounding materials. In some places the remains of these bousing teams can still be seen, with the streams redirected into a slushing system. Later on, purpose-built metal vats full of water were constructed in some places, which were worked mechanically. The galena was then taken to the smelt mills, which were usually built as close to the levels as possible. These buildings housed furnaces, where the ore was fed in and the smelters used their skill and experience to produce the purest possible lead. The smelters were the highest paid men in the mining operation, as it required considerable experience to be able to produce good quality lead. The men doing it may not have been aware of the chemical term for what they were doing, but it was quite sophisticated chemistry that they were performing. First turning the ore into lead oxide, and then adding carbon to move the oxygen to produce the finished metal. They controlled everything, lighting the furnace, choosing the type and amount of fuel to use, and the casting of the lead pigs at the end of the process. Coal produced the hottest fire, and Swaledale had a good supply of coal from Tan Hill collieries, but too much coal produced inferior lead, and so smelters generally used wood when they could get it. The remains of the peat drying buildings can be seen at Grinton Oldgang mines. At Grinton, the furnace buildings, what we've just looked at there, are very well preserved. The remains of two furnaces in the water wheel building which powered the bellows are still in good condition after smelting into lead pigs. There was nothing left to do except transport it to market. Many local towns had active lead markets, particularly Richmond and North Allerton. The lead ingots would be taken by pony and cart down the dale to these towns and sold. Towards the end of the 19th century, Spain and the US were producing much greater quantities of lead at much cheaper cost. Over the space of a couple of decades, the mine operations in Swaledale and the rest of the Yorkshire Dales came to a halt, as the mines became unprofitable to work. The ore winners eventually became dead men, also in an economical sense. It's hard to know what the miners and their families thought about the decline in the local industry. Life in the mines was tough, very tough. Miners had shifts of up to around 14 hours underground, doing back-breaking work in dark, cramped, wet and cold conditions, often with oxygen so low that candles barely had enough oxygen to burn. On top of this, they had to walk to and from the mines from their homes in the villages, a walk which could be many miles each way and would often be done in the cold and dark. Despite all this hardship with the decline of the Yorkshire lead mines, many of the miners left to go and work in other mines. Many left for Lancashire to work in the coal mines. Reef, the largest village in the Dale, had a population of 1,425 in 1821. A century later this was down to only 616, and has risen only very slightly since then. With the departure of mining and most of its population, life in the Dales became much quieter and very different in character. Farming, mostly upland sheep and some cows, became almost the sole economic activity in the Dale, with a little bit of knitting the tough wool of the Swaledale sheep into coarse but warm woolens. It was only with widespread acceptance of the idea of enjoying countryside that the Yorkshire Dales began to return to activity, and this activity is still what keeps the Yorkshire Dales going today, even though quite a number of small businesses and artists have taken up residence in the area. Reef, in particular, has a large number of artists and architecture endeavours. You can just tell just by looking at this now, the scale on which things are operated on. So yeah, thanks again for watching this video. If you haven't already, then consider subscribing to the channel, it's much appreciated. Yeah, so it's a wonderful area this. You can park at Surrender Bridge, it's free parking, and there's a lot of history to have a look. There's some, obviously the mines that I'd like to go back and have a look at, which I will do. So that's probably one for the future. So until I see you on the next one, take care out there, and remember, subscribe to the channel. Thanks very much guys, see ya.